Hi everybody, thanks for coming along. The story of this paper begins with my book, Fixing Reference, which came out at the end of 2015. The question in that book, the central question, was the question at the top of this slide. How do the relations that secure the aboutness of our ordinary thoughts do their aboutness fixing work? By ordinary thoughts, I meant the kinds of thoughts that we form by uptake from a perceptual link, an attentional perceptual link with an object, and express using this or that, as in case 1, or the kinds of thoughts that we form by uptake from a testimony stream and express using proper names, as in case 2, and cases relevantly similar to these. The question of how aboutness fixing works in this kind of case was the central question of the traditional theory of reference, and that question had a range of familiar answers. There were descriptivist views, there were causalist views, and there were hybrid views. For example, Evans's view that reference fixing, aboutness fixing, in cases involving proper names, is tied to the notion of a dominant causal source. In Fixing Reference, I proposed something different. So the suggestion there was that the relations that secure the aboutness of our ordinary thoughts do their aboutness fixing work by securing what I called cognitive focus. To introduce the notion of cognitive focus, let's start with telescopes. Suppose you've got a telescope and it's focused on an object in the night sky. Now, does the fact that your telescope is focused on this object guarantee that the report the telescope delivers will match what the object is like? Obviously not. Something unlucky might go wrong. But the fact that your telescope is focused on the object does guarantee something, and the something that it guarantees is what I've tried to capture in this formulation, telescopic focus, that's written on the slide. If a telescope is focused on an object, the report it delivers will match what the object is like unless some unlucky spoiler intervenes. And the notion of cognitive focus that I'm claiming provides the key to answering the traditional question of the theory of reference. That notion is a structural parallel to the notion of telescopic focus. So the suggestion is that an aboutness fixing relation between a subject and an object does its aboutness fixing work by making available a means of justification which will deliver beliefs that match what the object is like unless some unlucky spoiler intervenes. In the book, I argue for this claim, starting with two basic principles, or two principles I take to be basic. Firstly, there's a principle connecting aboutness and truth. That principle says, if your A is F belief is about object O, it's true if and only if O is F. So if my belief that Jack has fleas is about my dog, it's true if and only if he has fleas. That's the aboutness and truth principle. And then there's a truth and justification principle. If a belief is justified, the subject will be unlucky if it's not true. That's an approximate formulation, obviously. So look, we've got a principle connecting aboutness and truth, a principle connecting truth and justification, and now it's going to be very disappointing if we can't cut that intermediate term and get a third principle connecting aboutness and justification. And that's the principle which is the central principle of my cognitive focus framework. So here it is in approximate form, the aboutness and justification principle. The body of beliefs you'd express using singular term A is about object O if and only if beliefs generated by the associated means of justification will match what O is like unless some unlucky spoiler intervenes. So for the case where you are forming beliefs by uptake from an attentional perceptual link with an object, and beliefs that you'd express using that, And our question was, how is your perceptual link with the object putting you in a position to have thoughts about it? And the answer that I proposed in the book is that your perceptual link is putting you in a position to think about the object by providing a means of justification such that beliefs justified by that means, if you form any, will match what the object is like unless some unlucky spoiler intervenes. So that was the central proposal of my 2015 book. The first section of this paper provides an improved version of the argument for the basic principle of this framework, the aboutness and justification principle. So one new thing that happens in this paper is presentation of what I take to be an improved argument for the aboutness and justification principle, and therefore for this whole cognitive focus framework. But the main new thing that happens is extension of the discussion from the case of the solo subject, thinking about things in the world, to the case of linguistic communication. Suppose we ask, what is our language understanding information processing in the business of doing? Here's what I take to be a standard answer to that question, which I've called the conservative picture. The conservative picture says that for the case of declarative sentences, the information processing that generates language understanding works on an utterance and on relevant features of the context with the goal of calculating the claim about the world that the speaker is making to the degree of resolution required by the purpose of the utterance. So if we were to feed in there the linguist's notion of a question under discussion, the suggestion would be that what the hearer's language understanding information processing is in the business of doing is looking for a claim about the world that the speaker is to be treated as making, where that claim needs to be sufficiently specific to answer the question under discussion and doesn't need to be any more specific than that. So that's what I've called the conservative picture. The framework that I'm proposing, the cognitive focus framework, generates an alternative. According to this alternative picture, language understanding information processing is in the business of looking for relations of cognitive focus. So the suggestion is the information processing that generates language understanding is looking for relations of cognitive focus. The hearer is trying to achieve cognitive focus on the speaker and to join with the speaker in achieving joint cognitive focus on things in the world. So the suggestion is a model of language understanding built around this notion of cognitive focus. The suggestion is that the information processing that generates language understanding is looking for relations of cognitive focus. The hearer is trying to achieve cognitive focus on the speaker and to join with the speaker in achieving joint cognitive focus on things in the world. How might you argue for this view? Well, there are going to be two kinds of argument. Firstly, arguments from first principles. So here, very roughly, the suggestion is that if you take the cognitive focus framework, which is a framework for accounts of thought about objects, and you add the claim that language understanding is a means to putting the hearer in a position to have a characteristic kind of thought about the speaker and to join with the speaker in having a characteristic kind of thought about the world, then what I've called the alternative picture of language understanding is just what you get. Take the cognitive focus framework, ask, okay, how does language understanding work if this is how aboutness fixing works? And you get the cognitive focus model of language understanding. So that's one argument for what I'm calling the alternative picture. The other kind of argument is an argument from explanatory power. And I actually think that this model of language understanding has a lot of explanatory power. There are a lot of questions that it can answer, puzzles that it can solve. It explains the notion of conversational implicature. It explains various things about ways we misunderstand one another. It explains things about phenomena of loose use. And it explains under-specification puzzles involving singular terms, which is the case explored in this paper. And then, I think it explains a whole lot of other things as well. Here's the puzzle about specificity that I discuss in the paper. It's a puzzle about demonstratives. Let's start with an initial observation. In most cases, felicitous use of a demonstrative requires that the context supply enough of a demonstration to determine a specific referent. So, for example, if in the current context I say, "That's red," well, in the current context, there's no demonstration to hook my use of that onto a specific object, so you're not in a position to understand what I've said. Infelicity. Now, there are exceptions to this initial observation. So, for example, suppose we're going through the faculty car park and everybody's got Toyota Corollas and Honda Civics, and then there is a Rolls-Royce Silver Ghost. You say to me, "That car's a status symbol." Well, you might be talking about the car token or the car type. There's not enough of a demonstration provided in the context to determine whether it's the token or the type that you're talking about, so there's not enough of a demonstration to determine a specific referent, and yet I perfectly well understood what you said. So this is a case, it seems, of felicitous underspecification. Or again, maybe you arrive home and the person that you live with says, "This arrived today," pointing to a parcel. Well, they might be talking about the physical package, or they might be talking about the nice new stovetop espresso maker that it contains. The context doesn't do enough to determine a specific referent, but again, it looks like this is a case where there's no infelicity. Felicitous underspecification. Now, the conservative picture has no trouble, it seems, explaining this combination. That's to say, the initial observation that in most cases, felicitous use of a demonstrative requires that the context supply enough of a demonstration to determine a specific referent, and the observation that there are exceptions to this initial rule. According to the conservative picture, we can say, felicitous use requires that the context supply enough of a demonstration to determine a referent to the level of specificity required by communicative purposes. So the idea is that in the "that car's a status symbol" case, communicative purposes don't require that specificity go down fine-grained enough to distinguish car token from car type. So that's why the underspecification in this case doesn't generate infelicity. But there are counterexamples to this conservative account of the specificity and underspecification phenomena. Here are two. So suppose the following backstory. Suppose that I've been complaining about the cost of living, and you've offered various examples of cheap things, and for each of your examples I've said, no, that's expensive. You've accused me of claiming that everything is expensive just as a matter of miserable principle, and I say, looking over your shoulder to a part of the room populated with consumer goods, nonsense, that's cheap and so is that. Or again, here's another backstory. You visit my graduate class, and beforehand, I tell you that I think it takes only 1 or 2 good students to make a graduate class feel worthwhile. The session goes really badly, And as we leave the room, you say to me quietly and tactfully, "So does this class feel worthwhile?" And I say, without looking back into the room, without doing anything to narrow down which of the handful of female students I mean, I say, "She's a really good student. It's a pity she didn't say anything," and then go walking on down the corridor. Now, in each of these cases, the context doesn't supply enough of a demonstration to determine a specific referent. And in each case, I take it that the utterance is infelicitous. You're going to be, right? You're not in a position to understand what I've said. But think about what the communicative purposes are in each case. So in the first case, if we want to talk about questions under discussion, the question under discussion is just whether I'm prepared to admit that anything is cheap. And that question under discussion, you are in a position to answer. Similarly, in the graduate class case, question under discussion is just whether I think the class contains any good students. So in each of these cases, we've got under-specification and we've got felicitousness of the utterance, but the conservative explanation for felicitous under-specification, for infelicitous under-specification doesn't apply. So there's the puzzle. And in the last part of the paper, I show how I think the cognitive focus framework solves it. But very roughly, here's the idea. So the suggestion is that when a speaker makes a "that is if" utterance, the speaker is to be regarded as doing two things. Firstly, proposing that the hearer join the speaker in a cognitive focus sustaining information marshalling activity, and secondly, proposing a move within this activity. Now, if you stay with the conservative picture, you're going to think that these phenomena about specificity and underspecification and felicity or not for uses of demonstratives are to be explained in terms of how specific you've got to be to answer the question under discussion. What I'm proposing is something different, that the specificity and underspecification and felicity or not phenomena are to be explained by the level of specificity or resolution that's required for the cognitive focus sustaining information marshalling activity to get off the ground. Okay, so I'd like to thank Zoltan for his extremely thought-provoking companion paper, and hopefully we're going to manage to have some kind of discussion.